episode of the Best Book Club. I'm your host, NeufAtora, and this is the podcast where I discuss the best stories with the best minds in the community. On this episode, I'll be discussing A Trip of Survival in Wedgies by R.T. Blackwood. With me, I have Hans Gutherson. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me on. This is very exciting.
Yeah, first R.T. Blackwood story that we're discussing on the podcast.
Woohoo!
So it was first posted on DA on October 24th, 2021, and it's about a duo attempting to survive in a post apocalyptic world while maintaining their humanity and seeking out connection wherever they can, yet being repulsed by what they find. So I'm
Pretty good.
curious to start out this conversation. Do you think the afflicted people or pullers are actually zombies? They do resemble typical zombies in some ways, though they're only focused on wedgies and they don't seem to be corpses.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to tell, the details we get of them. They certainly, in their behavior and goals, resemble zombies in that they want to turn people and don't seem entirely human. So I don't know. I guess they're kind of their own beast of a person that are zombie-like. That might be, one way to look at them.
Yeah, they seem kind of potentially brain dead
Mm.
somehow. Like
Yeah.
however this, if it's a virus or whatever, somehow it did that, but it's hard to tell, or if it's more just they're just the extreme end of fetishists, as Harris calls them.
Yeah, that's the cool thing. And with that character and with the story in general, it's like they're pretty much zombies and how they operate and how we see them. They're just sort of lost themselves. But yeah, there's, the story in its way as horror sort of operates as a vehicle for always. It's pretty metaphoric for, the fetish if people lose themselves, or if it gets corrupted in any way. Like, what if it goes mainstream, which is what sort of zombie apocalypse stories are, or something, the virus going mainstream and taking over the world and destroying it. Like, what if, the fetish goes mainstream and you have just a few people trying to, like, that changes everything for them. In Harris's case, it's like these wedgies are everywhere. And do you sort of join, the crowd and go where the bandwagon is and what all the hype is, and sort of fall in with that big crowd? Or do you sort of continue to experience it the way you always have, kind of privately and by yourself? So that's one of the ways I looked at this story, as this kind of metaphor.
Yeah, and do you, if you are someone who's into them in this landscape where it's become such a bad thing and it's become such a traumatic thing to other people, do you uh, perform self exile? It seems like
Mm.
that's sort of what Harris is doing.
Yeah,
Like,
it's true, like it's kind of a fetishist dream, right? To be able to turn yourself over to these zombies and become a puller and just live, with just that in mind and that being your desire and having, truly no consequences. Except unless you get killed or something, but you're not thinking that far ahead, right? The goal is to
mhm.
spread, it seems. So, like, the fact, Harris resists that and says, I'm going to exile myself, but I'm going to see them from a distance. I'm going to kind of, suffer in silence, feeling
Mhm.
like, do I want that? And probably, secretly wanting it and wanting that freedom, but knowing, like you're going to lose something if you go with it. So he's a very fascinating character in my
Yeah,
mind for all of that.
for sure. Yeah, despite how such a small part he actually plays in the story, there is quite a bit to it.
Yeah,
It's
and it
really
was
nice.
apparently even smaller to begin with. Like the little note he leaves at the end
Hmm.
hints like he added, I guess, that scene where she finds him in the bathroom, sort of giving himself a wedgie, and you kind of like thinking to yourself like, yeah, could this be what turns him, or like, just the idea that wedgies must be such a scary thing now in the world. So to see someone doing this, to themselves might be pretty terrifying to be like, oh man, are they gonna turn, sort of
Yeah.
thing. Yes, he's very fascinating to me.
For sure. Now, what I've typically seen in zombie stories when a radio is brought into the equation is one of the main characters using it to call out to other people. I
Mm.
liked seeing Ash and Calvin being on the receiving end of the transmission and how they process the potential for help and an escape.
Yeah, it starts out kind of cool like that, you know?
Hmm.
It's like they're not able to get in touch with anybody. It is a sort of story of isolation, as you sort of know, right? The
Hmm.
two characters have kind of exiled themselves. I mean, for all we know, they think they're the only ones around. And it seems like Calvin, kind of wants it that way. He, likes being alone with this woman and gets to be this kind of hero to her in some ways. But also, he is scared, probably
Yeah.
rightly so, of what's out there, the monsters, but also the other humans. And he gives a couple scenarios, of stuff
Yeah.
that we've seen in zombie stories, which is fun meta almost, but also just like things you'd probably be really scared of after living, in fear of these creatures who you can't reason with, or you have to sort of put down in some ways to kind of stop them. There's
Yeah.
no coming back if they get you, really. So yeah, it kind of grounds it, kind of impressively in this very what feels realist and this sort of cool dialogue of just like he's trying to get a feel for what Asha's talking about, and you get a little details of what their city's like. They're gonna walk and it's gonna take this long. Like it's and you learn a bit about them. Like when Calvin says I'm realistic, there's no one left to trust, and she says not with that attitude. You see their dichotomy like right away, without a sort of breakdown of Calvin doesn't trust anyone, and he thinks there's no, and he's been burned before, and he's scared, and but Asha's more optimistic. It's like no, like they're gonna talk, and we're gonna reveal these things. So I think that was really well handled.
Yeah, and the like especially with like the thing about cannibals,
Yeah,
it really does it tells a little bit, but it implies so much of like just the horrors that they've seen since this outbreak happened.
yeah,
And I like that you call it a story of isolation because in some ways Ash and Calvin are even isolating uh, from each other.
ooh, that's good. That's a
Like,
great
especially
insight.
especially Calvin. He's keeping
Yeah.
all of these emotions to himself, and uh, I did sort of start to see like did sort of start to go down the line of thinking of like, as soon as he started thinking, oh, when this is over, I'm gonna tell her all about how I'm feeling. He's probably gonna get
He's
turned.
going
He's probably
down.
gonna get
He
turned
ain't gonna live.
before
Yeah.
he can say anything.
Yeah. That's
Because
how it goes,
that is
unfortunately.
a yeah,
Yeah.
that's a big trope of. I don't think it's even just
Sure.
zombie stories, but
No.
survival
Yeah.
stories in general. Like
Absolutely. Yeah.
as
Yeah.
soon as you start pinning a major hope on when we get
Mm.
through something, then you're probably gonna die.
Yeah, that's the end of you. Yeah, that's great. I love your insight though. It's a story of isolation, and we see that with both of them from each other. I mean, I got this feeling at the end with Asha, she was kind of keeping Calvin at arm's length, like friend zoning him, you know, just because that's how she kind of viewed him. And it's
Hmm.
in other stories, that maybe don't maybe take it as realistic or something. It's like, nah, they're together, so of course they're gonna get together, and they're gonna be dating and they're gonna be, having sex, whatever. It's like, nah, like that might just not happen,
Hmm.
for whatever reason. They just aren't into each other. Just because they're survivors doesn't mean, they're gonna be soulmates.
Yeah.
And the story, he sacrifices himself for her in the end, and we see that sort of selfless act, but there's not a moment where she's like tries to really stop him, or tries to be like, no, we both get out of here together. It's like there's a part of the world that really is just about surviving now, and I
Yeah.
think the grim ending helps with that. So both get on the train, and we don't even know what happens to her at the end, which I
Hmm.
thought was a really cool choice. I always assume the train is a pretty safe place and she gets there okay, but I mean, what's to happen next? I don't know. Um, like, yeah, I mean, it could go anywhere. So, and I think that's kind of cool, that openness, and like how is she affected by it, losing Calvin and stuff. I don't know, but that's really cool to think about.
For sure. I mean, speaking of the train, it seems like an odd mode of transport for this world, since
Yeah,
it would make even more noise than a motor vehicle, and I think it
that's
would draw in
true.
the pullers more rapidly than normal.
Yeah. And if you think too, like if it's a very long train, uh, I mean, and if there's stops and stuff, I mean, yeah, it wouldn't be hard to kind of get spotted and for people to, I don't know, get on it at different moments. Like, when they're walking along the train tracks, there's some really close by and
Mm-hmm.
jump them. So I mean, potentially, along their path on the train, there might be some more hanging around there or in the stops, things like that.
Yeah.
Who could maybe jump at the train even if the doors are closed. I mean, I guess the cool thing about a train compared to cars, there shouldn't be anything in their way. So
Right.
if you get it going and the track is clear, you should be able to get pretty far. Kind of like Train to Busan, which is one of the best zombie movies ever. They're able to get super far. There's no traffic in the way, no real like people gonna be blocking you. And if there's a puller in the way, train could kind of just run them down, no problem, sort of thing. So it kind of direct to go places, but yeah, at the same time, certainly. I mean, just getting onto it, you have this big station where there could be a lot of pullers around. I mean, Train to Busan is a good example because there's a stop where they land and they're like, okay, we're safe now. And, it's a giant train station, so a huge horde of zombies appear and they have to get back on the train. And you're like, oh, Lord. So it's a dangerous, I think basically everything's kind of dangerous, but it's probably a safer bet than some modes of transportation, I would assume.
Yeah. I mean, it could if they're able to get it up to a regular speed, it could make
Yeah,
for a good battering ram and just kind of like any pullers that sort of try to jump on or whatever, they're torn to pieces by the velocity of the train. But
yeah,
I'm also wondering how they got this train working at all, since they probably
yeah.
need more than just an engineer to run it. And
Probably.
who knows how wrecked it was, how thoroughly they checked the train for pullers.
Yeah. Great question. Yeah, I mean that's awesome questions. And some things, like I was just not thinking probably in the moment, but
Hmm.
considerations totally. Like for all they know, if they start taking off in this train, some cabins, you're gonna check them. They're gonna be pullers just chilling on it still. Maybe they got locked on there at some other point. Yeah,
Hmm.
or totally. Maybe they only get a certain distance, and for whatever reason, they're not able to keep going. You need some engineers to operate it, or I guess if you had some detailed manuals or something. But I mean, if something breaks,
Hmm.
yeah, like I mean, this story's set in the future, so I don't know how well maintained the trains are, or how
Yeah.
long the apocalypse has happened for. At
Hmm.
which point, yeah, there's been no maintenance on these potentially. So yeah, these are great questions, and I love that you're asking them and thinking that because I was thinking similar questions, and I think it's a good testament to the quality of the story and how drawn into the world we kind of are, where we're kind of fearing for them and hoping that everything's gonna work out on this train.
Yeah, I mean it it also depends on like what kind of train it is, like if they need
Yeah,
fuel or whatnot, like
true.
how well it was
Yeah,
actually repaired and started up.
absolutely,
Because it could just
absolutely.
break
Yeah,
down in the middle of the journey, or I could run out of
absolutely.
fuel
Yeah,
if it is an older
yeah,
train, or like electricity
yeah.
if it's electric. How did they get the electricity to go? Why wouldn't they?
Yes, yeah.
I are there other uses for that are they using the electricity other ways? Like there's so many questions
Great
just about this
question.
chain,
So
the
many.
train.
Yeah, yeah. It's awesome. I love that.
I'm curious why you think zombie apocalypse stories all have the trope of naming zombies in their own way. I think it works decently well if
Uh,
the zombies are actually distinct from other iterations, like in this story, but otherwise it just kind of
yeah.
seems dumb to me if it like 'Cause, like these zombies, these polars are very distinct because of what they focus
Mm,
on, and sort of even like the
yeah.
way they're described. It's hard to tell if they actually are. They resemble typical zombies, but in so
Yeah.
many zombie stories, it's just like runners or crawler. You just come up with these
Yes.
stupid names that like we know they're
Yeah.
zombies. You can just call them that.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, Walking Dead's a good example because that show, spanned many, many seasons, and many groups would have different names for them. And you
Oh,
meet a new
jeez.
group, and they call them biters or they call them walkers, and they had different names for them. A lot of different groups did. I think, yeah, I feel like in a way it's kind of world building. Like, R.T. Blackwood could have called them zombies in his. Um, but of course, with that, we would have been thinking they're actual zombies, and it would have been like
Hmm.
that's a bit strange not to change it. So you're totally right when you say they're distinct enough to warrant it.
Yeah.
Yeah, in other cases, I think it's maybe you're trying to put your own kind of spin on it. Like in Walking Dead, I think their term walkers became kind of iconic because they used it so much, and it was just like their way of referring to zombies. Um, and obviously, The Last of Us, had different versions of zombies, bloaters, and stuff like that. That, like, they were totally different kinds of zombies with different, abilities and shapes and stuff.
Hmm.
So, like, again, kind of warrants it. Yeah, I think it's probably, just being a little creative, a little world building, the fact that a different group has a different name for it. Instead of it probably would get a little boring if everyone's like, the zombies are coming.
Hmm.
But if there's a reason for a particular name, if it can work towards some world building or something, and yeah, like I feel like Walking Dead too, they had some of that. They would ask them, "Why do you call them this instead of walkers or something?" It's like, "Oh, because they did X before, so we call them that." So you get maybe a little bit of that, but certainly, yeah. I mean, I would not take offense if they just called them all zombies in The Walking Dead or something. That would work totally fine.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. It's. I think in things like video games, it does also work because then it's easier to remember the different enemy types because you're playing a video game at that point.
True.
So
That's a great point.
it's kind of
Yeah,
expected that you're gonna have different enemy types, not just the same one every
that's a great
encounter.
point. Yeah, that's a good insight for sure.
Calvin not wanting to leave, even if the station was only an hour away, is a little odd to me, even if there are polars all over the place. Because I have to imagine they're forced to leave their location from time to time so they can gather supplies when they run low. And even if they find out that there isn't a train at the station, or I guess they could run into a dangerous situation otherwise. I mean, they could scope out a different area, potentially find a more secure spot to hole up in, or more supplies to actually defend themselves with, and like guns potentially, or bow and arrow, or they could find other survivors to group up with.
Yeah, I love that question. I think there's a number of complicated and conflicting reasons he's so reluctant. One of them is simply fear, as
Yeah,
he identifies it. And I mean, even if it were an hour, even if it were closer, there's this idea that, like, we really should only go out when it's absolutely necessary. And this could be a wild goose chase, or it could be a trap. And you're right, they could scope it out. It's feels like a risk. Basically, anytime you're going outside is probably a risk when you're dealing with, the end of the world. And anytime you go outside, you could get spotted by pullers or other humans like cannibals or other worse scavenger groups. So I think there's that. I think, too, there's the more complicated but somewhat alluded to idea that, he enjoys being alone with Asha and having their little survival unit.
yeah,
And if they were to find, this train and it were to exist and he were not to get killed, which he does, so he's maybe kind of scared of that happening, on the way, or her dying and him surviving. The idea that, if they find others, it's not going to be him and her anymore. So this chance of, telling her how he feels, which he hasn't gotten around to and kind of struggles with, he wouldn't really be able to do that. Maybe she finds somebody else, you know, maybe they lose whatever they had. They're a group of survivors who sort of found each other, and that would create a very special bond. And he feels it very strongly. Asha, we sort of learn at the end, doesn't reciprocate a lot of that. But certainly, I feel like maybe he thinks, even if it's best, which he probably feels in a way, especially if he knows the train is real, like it's probably best that they find other survivors, pool their resources, strengthen numbers, It's like you would be losing this thing, this isolation that they've chosen, this powerful bond that they have, that's going to change. And I
Yeah.
think that's a kind of scary prospect for people, when you're in something comfortable, if you have this sort of relationship to kind of keep it as is, even if it's
Yeah.
not the best thing. And I mean, he shows some selflessness again here for the first time when he says, like, let's do it. He's putting aside the fear and he's willing to potentially lose that, it seems like. And
Yeah.
he trusts her. He's showing some trust in her, too. Like, he's scared, but he goes along with it anyway. But he's not, he's not someone who isn't going to lay out his side of it, who isn't kind of careful and has thought about a lot of angles and has the fear. So I think it's a lot of those things. I think
Yeah. I mean, as comfortable as they can be given this kind of situation.
for
And
sure. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
I wonder if some of it is sort of the hope of exposure to him. You know, that sort of thing where like the longer you're around something, the more you're gonna like it. So maybe there's some hope
Mm.
in him that given enough time, she will feel the same way about him.
Yeah, mere exposure effect. I haven't
Yes.
thought about that in such a long time, but one of my favorite psychological concepts. Yeah, the idea that, as you rightly said, this, just being around something, you're gonna like it more. Yeah, that might be part of it. Absolutely, and he's thinking being with her, alone with her, surviving with her. I mean, they have a good friendship. They're
Hmm.
joking. I think one of really good line is that joke they tell about the puller, in the
Yeah.
park. And I love that line. That's great world building, So they like have this fun connection, but as we go, we realize, it's probably not going to become anything more, despite Kelvin wanting it. So yeah, if they were just together alone, and that's a kind of science fictiony trope too, when you're the last two people left. But certainly, I mean, Asha doesn't feel the same way. So I think, yeah, I think Kelvin certainly would like it
Hmm.
and safe for as long as he can. That would probably be ideal, but he sees the sense in going out there, and he knows, as he kind of points out, Asha wouldn't forgive him. She would kind of resent him for it, which I thought was a very deep insight too, and a kind of good understanding of, like, yeah, that is what would happen. If she really wanted in, and if they ever knew or didn't know the train was legit, if it was, and he didn't take that opportunity, like, how do you get over that in a relationship,
Yeah.
no
Well,
matter how strong a bond, no matter how exiled you are?
I mean, even if they never find out if it actually exists or not, just the potential of it potentially
Yeah,
being there
a
is,
potential.
and not having explored it, yeah, it would lead to some resentment.
Yeah,
And
absolutely. Yeah,
I mean, that joke did make me laugh a little bit the first time I read it. So
yeah, I love
it was
that.
decent. It was pretty well put together.
Yeah, I like that.
I think my favorite part of the story was Calvin's dream. It shows just how much
Mm,
psychological damage has been done to these survivors, and how a seemingly innocuous prank has turned into something so traumatizing. And it made me wonder what Ash's dreams are like if they contain anything similar. I'm sure, since she doesn't like, she doesn't feel the same way about Calvin as he does about her. It's probably not the first part isn't part of it, but maybe she's thinking of someone else, or it's just the second part of it.
yeah, that's a great point. I mean, we get some insights into their psychology through some dialogue and such, but I feel like we get one of the truest glimpses into how scarred Calvin is with that nightmare and these sort of fears that they carry, that like at any moment people could turn and what they have could be lost, and by what they have I mean like their humanity, or anything like that. So yeah, I imagine dreams like that aren't uncommon Probably something they deal with a lot. And I mean, in a way, it's maybe kind of foreshadowing the loss that's gonna happen. The fact they're gonna lose what they had, the two of them, by going out. And like Asha gets to safety in the end, but Kelvin's kind of, he gets trapped in this almost nightmare reality. I imagine as a puller, in the end.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I really would have liked to see a survivor actually be turned into a puller. So at the
Yes,
end,
yeah, that would have been
seeing
cool.
potentially seeing a little bit of that, where maybe Asha turns around for a second, like as she's getting on the train, and she sees him rising or something after
Yeah,
their
would have been
attack.
cool to see what that
Because
looks like.
I'm
Yeah,
curious on how it actually works. I'm thinking of something like
yeah,
the Scourge from Pennyboard, where enough wedgies
sure.
infect the mind and body. But what do you think? How do you think it
Yeah,
works?
yeah, I kind of love that we don't entirely know. There's like this assumption, that's been around so long in the world, the
Mhm.
way it's established. It's like it's not a fresh thing. They've seen it happen, it's just so omnipresent that like we're not going to see it. You know what I mean? Because it's a behind the scenes thing at this point for the world because it's happened so much, which I kind of like. But certainly, I imagine as you said, like he'll go down and kind of rise up, looking animalistic, I guess so to speak.
Mhm.
Like not the same person anymore. His eyes probably glazed over, that sort of thing. Whatever was there is gone, um, and he'll just be sort of looking for underwear to pull
Yeah.
after that. So yeah, like a pretty straightforward process where something happens. I don't know, like what it would be. I guess something in the mind, triggered by the wedgie. But that's pretty much how I pictured it.
Mm. Yeah. And maybe if it starts happening immediately on the first pull, or it takes a little bit
Yeah,
to go with it to get it going.
yeah, that's a good question. Yeah.
Harris not killing the Polar is quite the interesting choice, in my opinion. I think it's great
Mm,
foreshadowing to him having a fetish and relating to Polars in some ways, because he still sees them as human to some degree. So he
yeah.
doesn't want to kill them, he just wants to drive them away so they can suffer in silence as he does.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. I think that's a great observation for sure. Yeah, like I said, I find him to be a fascinating character, and his view on polars is going to be super unique because he sort of, would see them as kind of a mirror to himself, I imagine, and we kind of get that, when he's looking down on some of them, and he, reveals to Ash's sort of secrets there at the end of the world. And I thought that was pretty beautiful scene and moment. And certainly, yeah, it's a great foreshadowing there. And just, not everybody is going to see them as monsters, which I think is a good world building element too. Or the fact, we talk about the different names they have for them. Harris has a different name for the polars too. He calls them
Yeah.
fetishists. Um, and he says like now they're the majority, but he doesn't feel any less lonely, which
Hmm.
is such a fetishist thing in general, to feel lonely. And I think that was really well handled. So certainly, yeah, I mean he doesn't want to kill them, which you would probably think puts him in a lot of danger, and I don't know how long he could survive, but maybe there's also that, again, talking about complex motivations with him, maybe there's also a little bit of that secret hope he will get turned, by not killing him, maybe, there'll be a chance for him to get turned and he'll become one of them.
Yeah.
Maybe there's some too.
But it seems like he sort of understands that that shouldn't be all life is.
Yeah.
And even though he's self-exiled, he's sorry, keeping to himself. Um, I it kind of seems like he also wants people to stay with him. He's sort of more resigned to where he's at, more so than Calvin, since he decided says he doesn't want to go to see the train, even though both of them are going, and yet he opens up so easily. Like it's almost as if he was waiting for someone to stop by.
Yeah. Yeah, and he could have, as a lot of survivors probably would, he could have just ignored them. But he goes
Mm-hmm.
out, he risks himself to save them and bring them into his home. He has no clue who they are. They could be
Yeah.
very dangerous people. They could rob him, they could kill him. But I think being lonely is a very hard thing. And I think, Harris, for his self exiling that he does, as you aptly put it. I think he, like the others, don't really want to be alone, like Calvin
Mm-hmm.
and Asha. Calvin enjoys being alone with Asha, but at the same time, there's them leaving, and I feel like there is this desire to be among others, to create and recreate that community that would have been lost. The only ones really who have a community other than the group and the train who we meet, and we don't know how big that is, etc. The only real community is that of the pullers, right? Now, probably one of the biggest communities ever of people just, obsessed with wedgies and turning others to their cause. So, we get these very small groups that are coming together and trying to just kind of survive. Um, so I think that's really interesting to
Mm-hmm.
see the characters, struggle with that. It's like, do we stay? Do we go? What do we risk to try and find others? And these very zombie apocalypse questions, but applied through this cool wedgie fetish lens, which I thought really well handled.
Yeah. You saying should I stay or should it makes me think of the I think it's the Clash song.
Yeah, yeah,
Like I thought further like it keeps working like if I stay there will be trouble if I go it will be double. You don't
yes,
even
yes,
know.
yes. Yeah, you don't. It's so
Yeah.
true. Yeah, such a great, great song and great use of it. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah. It's kind of when I mean really when I kind of think about it, this story is kind of an interesting analogy of the community or like the actual
Mm,
wedgie community as a whole, where Harris is sort of representative of the people who understand that their actions will have repercussions on other people, and so
yeah.
they're very polite and they don't bother uh, people who just randomly post something, and the polars I feel very representative of some of those people who just incessantly spam like celebrities that post a
Mm,
picture or just famous people like they just
yeah.
nonstop like can you do more of this, can you do more, it's bothering people and
Yeah.
freaking them out.
I love that. That's such an awesome insight. I mean, it really is the difference between, the fetishists who sort of just keep it private to those who kind of force it onto others,
Yeah.
and uh, I forget what the term is, but definitely exposing the fetish to them and imposing it on others, as I said, and I think that's a great way to look at the story and the lens there. I mean, Harris, he goes in the bathroom and he's alone when he's sort of giving himself a wedgie, and he tells her about the fetish, which is a bit of him, putting it on to Asha and telling her about it, but I don't I didn't read it in a way to sort of that made it too uncomfortable. Obviously she's kind of frightened by this
Hmm.
prospect, to be close to someone who kind of resembles the pullers in her mind. But it's not like he's trying to give her a wedgie or anything like that. Or he keeps giving himself one while she's watching, like anything too sexual. But certainly the pullers are the extreme end of the fetishists with no inhibitions, no limits. They're going to give and get and try and bring everyone into their sphere as much as
Hmm.
possible. And certainly great comparison, as to the people online or community members who aren't afraid to just spam people with messages or whatever sort of behavior that takes on in real life or online.
Yeah, when they should be afraid to do that because it's in
Yeah,
some ways it's harassment and it's just annoying.
absolutely. Yeah.
I think it Asha doesn't want to stay. I feel like if it was been just kind of a someone who didn't have the fetish, then she might potentially have felt a little more draw to stay and at least try and convince the guy to go with them.
Mm,
Um, but because of what she sees as the potential for him to go after her and give them wedgies, I think it's
yeah,
sort of she's not really as inclined to try and convince Harris to go with them.
yeah. And he's probably not as inclined to go at the same time, you know?
Hmm.
Even if he was like, oh, maybe I'll go with you, yeah, Asha, knowing what she knows, scared that she is, that for all she knows, he's going to lose control. And for all we know, you know, him giving someone else a wedgie is going to turn them instantly, or him giving himself could turn him. We don't entirely know how that works, you know?
Yeah,
So certainly a lot of fear there, and that fear, you know, it drives a lot of their actions and a lot of the things they do in this story, and you know, how do you overcome that, and what do you do when the fear hits you? In Harris's case, you know, he goes and saves people, and he saves Calvin and Asha. Calvin sacrifices himself, you know, and Asha doesn't let those, you know, sacrifices go to waste. She runs to the train for the hope of something, you know, good, some safety and things like that. You know, yeah, and so certainly I think there's a lot of that acknowledgement of like, yeah, Harris could be dangerous. And even if he's not, if anyone finds out what he is, or that he's like the pullers, or he enjoys this, like, what if they just, you know, killed him out of fear, you know, because he's different.
yeah,
So I think there's a great, you know, metaphor and sort of message in that too. The fear he has over, you know, being exposed and what that's going to mean.
yeah.
And I think, you know, it's obviously higher stakes because he's going to get probably killed, or, you know, it could be worse. Um, in this apocalyptic setting where he resembles the monsters everyone fears, you know. But certainly a good metaphor for today and how a lot of us feel around the fetish and the fear of what happens if someone discovers it, or a lot of people find out. Like, how is our life going to change? You know, obviously, like I said, stakes inflated in horror, but the same questions applied.
Hmm. Yeah, and I mean, Harris seems like he seems very self-aware of the effect he'll have on just being around other people. So it definitely feels
Yeah,
like a self-exile.
I think so. Yeah.
Why do you think the pullers only go for regular humans instead of just wedging each other? I always figure that
Yeah.
zombies don't eat each other's brains because theirs rots away when they're turned. So maybe the
Mm.
pullers have already destroyed each other's underwear and just forgot. They forget how to put more on.
Yeah, I love that. And I think there's also an aspect of zombies, right, which is about spreading the disease and spreading the virus. Like any virus does, you know, naturally. Its goal is to kind of replicate and
Uh huh.
grow, as is, you know, any organism is to grow. So I feel like that's the puller's goal as well, where they could, and they maybe do, you know, give each other wedgies. The goal is to make others like them and keep spreading whatever it is that's, you know, infected them, so to speak, if you want to look at it like that. Maybe set them free if you think this is the right thing. And there's probably some in this world who are like, oh, yes, they are the right. They are the correct people. We are
Yeah.
not correct. We must become like them, you know, like the kind of zombie tropes of the people who worship the zombies, you know. Um, so certainly, I feel like that's probably a part of it. As typical zombie lore, they are trying to spread as much as possible, and that means the humans. For all we know, too, you know, they're feeding off of maybe the fresh underwear or something that hasn't been wedgied or something. Maybe that's part of it too.
Yeah, which is like how would they know? That's especially
Yeah,
if they are
exactly.
brain dead.
How would
How are
they
they able
know?
to figure
Yes.
this out?
Yeah, some very peculiar senses that they've developed. I guess maybe I don't know. It's good
Yeah.
questions.
Yeah. I mean that
Oh, cool.
it's said in that there are more than just the five senses, so maybe there is an underwear sense.
Could be. Could be.
Asha, in some ways, feels a little naive. Like she has too much faith and trust in other people and just potential for
Mm.
things to go right. Though she does also
Yeah.
seem to think a little ahead, like using Harris as a potential shield. But
Yeah.
then they'd probably be stuck with him, and they'd have to kill him. So
Mm.
I don't think it's quite thinking as far ahead as she should. Um,
Mm.
she's like especially trying to just deciding to go to the station. Um, it, we don't know if she truly thinks out all the possibilities and how risky it really is, like Calvin does.
Yeah, yeah, he tries to, point out some of the worst case scenarios there, but she's hopeful.
Right.
It seems like she really wants to risk it, even if it means, bad consequences. For her, it's worth it. And it is, I think, maybe some naivete, and it's maybe, being very hopeful and very optimistic, and, getting thrown this line, and she doesn't want to risk missing out. And I think probably a lot of survivors are probably in that same boat.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, if it were a trap, it would be a kind of masterful setup because you're really like, I have to go check this out. And maybe the train is evil and she won't really know because she's about to get on it. But yeah, I mean, I think certainly having sounds like she's a survivor for a while, probably in this place, we're really desperate for anything different and more safety and for something new and some change, you know? So perhaps she's willing to, put aside some of that concern. And she kind of has to play devil's advocate with Calvin, and kind of be like, push his concerns aside to convince him to go or that she really cares about going. So I
Yeah.
think that kind of butting of heads is really well done, that dichotomy. It's the should I stay or should I go now? Exactly like you
Mm-hmm.
said. And they realize, I think, both of them, like there's going to be trouble one way or the other. But what are they willing to endure? Like Calvin would be willing to stay there forever, and see what happens. Maybe they get closer and they fall in love, but Asha, that's not for her. She wants something different than what she has. So yeah, I think there's a lot of the motivations behind like everything they do pretty much, which I think is really cool, especially in such a short story.
Yeah. And it does seem like there's a part of Asha that would I can't think of the word. Where I guess she would I guess sort of capitulate and stick with Calvin if he put up enough of a fight to stay where they are, even
Yeah,
though there would be some resentment. It seems like she would stick with him, so
yeah.
she values his friendship and just having someone else be there with him, even if she doesn't feel uh, strong feelings for him.
Yeah, yeah. And in that way, Harris is another good foil for them, because they're not willing to be totally alone, either of them. Although, except at the very end, when, Calvin goes alone, sacrifice himself, and Asha runs off by herself into something new. So
Yeah.
there's that separation. But before that point, it certainly feels like, they're going to be there for each other. They're still this unit. They may not, fall in love, but they're survivors and they're friends and they will stick by each other. They're not going to abandon each other. They're going to hold up each other's ends. So, I mean, it's a very cool relationship, one that's kind of atypical in fetish stories because neither of them, give or get a wedgie from each other. Um, except for, in the dream, there's a little bit of that. And it's a cool, inversion of the tropes. It's not a very sexy hot dream where they're making out and there's wedgies. It's hot. It's like it's a nightmare and it's scary. And wedgies there, are the source of fear in the world. You know, which is such a turn from how they're usually used in stories, like as comedic effect or a sexual tool or a fun thing or even like domination submissions. It's like none of those things.
Mhm.
It's just pure like a scary, scary thing.
Yeah, I mean, Calvin isn't even interested in wedgies beyond like a very
Yeah.
small degree. As he said, he once things get hot, he wants the underwear to go down, not up.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit of
Yeah.
inversion from typical wedgie stories that way.
Absolutely, yeah,
And
yeah.
sort of
None of the
the
characters, except Terrace are into them.
yeah, and he's
And I
removed
mean,
from the main cast.
Absolutely right. Yeah.
Asha and Calvin are either braver or stupider than I would be to stay with Harris as long as they did, given that he reveals the similarities between himself and the Pullers. And Asha
Yeah.
speculates, like, is it possible for him to turn them or turn himself?
Yeah.
She does speculate that. So uh,
Yeah.
it's
For
it's
sure.
it, Asha's hope really seems to trump everything else that about Ash and Calvin. Like that seems to be the
Mm.
driving force between them. And
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it is a defining characteristic of her, where Calvin is kind of this fear and Harris may self isolation, Asha is this kind of, optimism maybe, or hope. Hope might be the better word, like she's willing to, give the train a chance, willing to give Harris a chance and trust, he's not going to turn them. Although she's not too stupid to realize, this might be a potential somehow, in some way, knowing what they know. So I like that we do see a lot of people thinking through the angles of things and the things they learn, it matters, and there's fear around a lot of information that they get. So it's not just like, oh, he's a fetishist. Doesn't matter. And then they do leave kind of quickly after, and they go without him. So like I think there's a lot of credence to what you're saying, and that, they realize being around him is a risk.
mm-hmm.
And it's too bad because it would have been cool to see more of him. He seems pretty capable.
Yeah, well, potentially, but he does seem to be performing a very delicate mental balancing act of
Mm,
should I continue to be on my own or should I just join the Pullers? So, for
yes,
all they
that's
know, if
such a
they
good
stick with
point.
him long enough, he just decides to invite the Pullers in and put
Yeah,
them
I could
directly in
see it.
harm's way.
Yeah, I could totally see it. Yeah, yeah. He's the kind of, he's risky from a mental perspective. Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah, like
such a good point.
maybe he's keeping those Pullers around his building on purpose, just in case he finally
Yeah,
decides to just give it up.
I could see it. I absolutely could see that. Yeah, I love that. I think that's a great, great read on it.
Do you think the Pullers actually have a disease, or is it possible for regular humans to turn others into Pullers? This is pure speculation because we have no idea.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I mean, feel like it's probably just the pullers themselves who are able to do it, but it might be cool, if there's like a typhoid Mary type case where someone isn't a puller but they can also spread it without knowing. Like
Mm,
still be a carrier of this thing and still give wedgies and spread it, without becoming a puller themselves entirely. That would be kind of cool. I can maybe see some of those. Like maybe, it does operate as a virus and it only spreads through underwear being pulled by pullers who are already infected. That's
yeah,
probably how I'd see it. Like that would be my guess, but I could be wrong. Maybe if Harris had given it to any of them, or even if Calvin or Ash had even they given one to each other, they would turn. I don't know. I'm gonna say though, you have to be a polar given to a human to infect them. It's my guess.
yeah. I mean, at the very least, it doesn't seem like if you give yourself a wedgie, you'll turn yourself. Um,
Doesn't seem like it. Yeah.
I guess we never find out how long the process actually takes. So maybe that's still a
Yeah.
possibility if it just takes longer.
Yeah.
But yeah, it seems it probably is just that the Polars have to change other people.
Yeah.
Out of everything that I've read so far in the community, this story is the epitome of the theme of Wedgies being a corrupting force, where the only
Mm.
people who seem to want to come together over them are completely avoided and shunned. And killed, really.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's kind of funny that this theme keeps coming up in all the stories that we're talking about, and this is the biggest example, I guess.
Yeah, it feels like a definitive example of that trope, if we want to call it that. That motif might be a better word, you know, Wedgies as this evil, corrupting force. I
Well,
mean,
it is a
certainly
theme.
those who get them here are become, you know, monsters, so to speak. And I think, yeah, it's doesn't get more clear cut than that. Um, so I mean, it's certainly a good example of that for sure.
Yeah, I mean this is definitely a theme as opposed to any like a motif or anything. A motif, if it was just like underwear is like consistently brought up or that would be a motif. But
Mm.
since it's this
Yeah, you're right.
full
Yeah,
idea that is
yeah,
continuously sort of explored in the background of so many stories.
yeah.
Uh, Calvin, towards the end, not believing their journey to the station to be a suicide mission, seems to be at odds with his original stance on it. It seems like he was pretty clear he did think it was a suicide mission while those pullers out there. Like, even, as he said, even if the station's only an hour away, you don't know what
Yeah.
it could be cannibal. Like he does see, it does seem like he pretty firmly believes it is a suicide mission. So I'm not quite sure why he then thinks that he he never would have gone on it if he thought it was.
Yeah. I mean, again, I think it goes back to what we were talking about when we talk about very complex motivations. I mean, there's what he says to Asha, and there's kind of what he feels, and I feel like that's some of what we're seeing at the end. Him kind of thinking to himself, going back over things, thinking, like I'm not dumb. If I knew we would get killed going out here, we wouldn't go. And I think that's the same thing he's telling her in the beginning and the same thing he does believe. But I mean, for all we know, it's not a super far journey as they know and they've gotten this far. So it doesn't seem like it maybe is a suicide mission. Like maybe it seems like it's doable and he probably felt it was or he probably really would have pushed back and they would have figured out some other way, if he really felt like there was no way they could do this. And at the same time, like I said, everything he's telling her in the beginning, I think it's to hold on to her, to hold on to what they have, So any kind of arguments he gives, there's the side of it that is the logic, and this is, it's a scary thing, it's frightening, we could die. And then the other part that's his heart, just like, I'm too scared to lose this. Like, even if it's a super easy mission, um, I don't want to risk losing you or anything. So then when you get to the end, and the train's right ahead of you, you realize, like, man, this is happening. He's kind of
Yeah.
thinking like he's actually going to get it, So there is that, internal shift that's going to happen. He's seeing it. He's saying, "We made it," you know. Um, and I think that's a kind of meaningful statement for him to realize, they've done it. Uh, and like he's coming to terms with a lot of things about himself in this moment. The fact like he wants him to see himself with Asha, but he realizes, he's not this perfect hero. He's got flaws. He's maybe doesn't, isn't someone who maybe deserves Asha. Maybe goes that far with some of it. He's looking to just sort of like, take stock of everything in these moments. Now that he's gotten so far and he's done something he maybe didn't think they could, or probably thought he could but didn't want to admit to, because then he's just giving into maybe losing her. So
Hmm.
I feel like it is quite complex and complicated, but you're totally right to call that out. Absolutely.
Hmm. I mean, speaking of Calvin, his fate does seem pretty clear at the end. Though, what
Yeah,
do you think happens to Asha? Does she actually make it to the supposed colony? Is there
I think
actually a
she makes it
colony?
to the train. I hope so. I'll be optimistic and hopeful like her
Okay.
and say, she makes it to the train and it takes her somewhere safe. I mean, RT Blackwood kind of, he leaves it open in the end. He even says, like, if you think something along the lines, if you think like the people are evil on the train or it's a trap, then, we get that common trope in in zombie fiction where it's like the humans are the real evil or just as evil, is better, not more evil but just as evil as the zombies, and that is a very common trope where they really are monsters too. So we don't really see that in this story. it's a good flip on that. It's like the pullers are the only real enemy. But if the people on a train are evil, which is possible, we would get that trope certainly.
Yeah.
What do you think though? Are you as optimistic and hopeful as me, or do you think she's kind of doomed?
I mean, the you do get that tiny little detail of the couple of people waving her on. So it seems like they readily enough accept her into their group, but who knows if she's like thrust into slavery or like she's
Mm,
assaulted by other people or all her stuff's
it's
taken
possible,
away
yeah.
or if she's used as bait to maybe I wonder if they're just if they don't want to sacrifice anyone in their group, they're just trying to get people to come as bait so they can uh, distract the pullers on the train.
Wow,
Maybe,
I like
maybe.
that. Yeah, could
Seems like
be.
a
I
long
like it.
shot.
There's a lot of cool potentials. No, I
Yeah,
think there's a lot of cool potentials. I like that it's left
I
open.
mean,
We
I,
don't know.
I think they definitely, um, I think they definitely run into some trouble at least on the journey, and I wouldn't be
Yeah,
surprised if there was a puller, at least a puller or two on the train. They
yeah.
just didn't check close enough. Um,
I
but
think you're right.
I think it would
Yeah,
be interesting and a subversion of the typical we're going to meet up with this colony and then they get there and it's this fully functioning thing, whether it's just people coming together making it work or military or government, like as a safe haven. I think it would be interesting if there actually wasn't anything there, or
yeah.
I get if you were to go like the more typical way of like it's a colony of cannibals or evil people, as you brought up.
Yeah, I think that's great.
So for the Witcher segment, which one do you think it falls
Mm,
under?
wow, that's a good question. Maybe alternative Earth, maybe?
Hmm.
Maybe both in terms of like, obviously it's not the real world, but I think we're kind of, developing the definitions a bit and evolving them a bit. So it's not just like if it's fantastical, it's fantastical, which I think is for the best. But in terms of, how the wedgies are maybe presented, the fact, he has this dream, I think that's for me the kind of alternative hint that we get, that like, the fact he's dreaming about it as he does, and it's a great plot device and it works really well for telling us about the character and the world. um, but certainly, he could be dreaming about any number of things, so maybe small things like that kind of twist the world so it kind of works well in as a wedgie story, if that makes sense.
For sure.
What do you think though? Am I off, do you
I mean,
think?
I agree. I think it is alternate because it makes complete sense to me that at least some fetishists would survive, and it would likely be a male,
Yeah,
as that is the vast majority of the community. I mean,
true.
we don't know what initially caused this thing to spread, if it is a disease or whatever it actually is. But there are plenty of diseases out there, like actual flesh eating bacteria, that could have the potential to cause a zombie outbreak. And it really only needs
Yeah,
some stupid scientists experimenting on it to cause it to mutate into a zombie apocalypse.
yeah. I like it.
And
Awesome.
just, I guess perhaps it brushes into idealistic a little bit because the zombies are actually just they only go after they only do they're only about wedgies as opposed to the actual horrifying thing of eating other people.
Yes. Yeah. Certainly not as gory and horrific, thankfully.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and all you get of like the difference between a puller and a regular human is that there's like they're drooling and their eyes are glazed over. Uh, they're
Yeah.
solely focused on wedges, so you don't have like arms rotting off or like missing eyes or like things like that. So it's
Yeah.
yeah,
That subtlety too is great, I think. It's such a it fits into this whole idea, a story's kind of this metaphor for the community,
hmm
or just for the fetish in general, right? Like you can't tell by looking at a fetishist like, oh, they're a fetishist, like and the fact is somewhat true here. Like obviously, the pullers are a bit distinct in their appearance, but they're not dramatically so. They don't, as you noted, don't have arms falling off or like, rotting flesh, and they don't smell of, death and decay.
yeah,
Um, they're not super far off from humans, And Harris, looking at him, you can't tell that he's a fetishist, So these like mysteries, and I love that aspect of it. Whereas like it's very clear who the zombies are and that they're evil. But the pullers, it's not that clear. So I feel like there's something to be said there in terms of what wedgies stand for and what
yeah,
fetishists are in society. That all those kind of cool questions. RT Blackwood does a good job with all that, I think.
yeah. I mean, if you had to pick between all the zombie apocalypses to ever exist, this is probably the best one to be in.
Yeah, true. Especially if you like wedgies, yeah.
Yeah. Well, is there anything else that you'd like to discuss?
No, I say go check out RT Blackwood. He's got some really cool stories. I'm a fan of his. Certainly more underrated, underknown in the community. But that story, A Trip of Survival and Wedgies, I think he's noted was his favorite of the ones he's done. So it's a good place to start. People haven't read them, and I mean, I like the title, and I like the characters, and I would love to see a sequel too.
hmm Yeah, for sure. Well, is there anything that you'd like to promote?
No, no, I'll just repeat and say, RT Blackwood,
Very
go read his stories.
nice. Well, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me on, my friend. Always the best.
Yes, it is. It always is. Well, if there's anything that you'd like to hear me discuss, or if you'd like to come on for an episode, leave a comment or send me a message on DeviantArt, Lucky Fetish, or Discord as NeufAtora. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode of the Best Book Club.